Good evening, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. With me is my weekly guest, geopolitical analyst and author J.R. Nyquist. J.R. Nyquist just came out about a day or two ago with a new article on his blog. And Jeff, why don't we fire away and summarize your article for the viewers here, please?
Yeah, well, I've had a sort of thing in my mind for a long time, watching everything unfold over the last 3 years, and it's that our politicians are rather empty, and that there is a nothingness about them and about the political discourse. And I felt this way a long time, but it's been particularly intense since 2020. And I remember this book that I really enjoyed when I was much younger. It's Kierkegaard's The Present Age. And of course, this book, I just adore this book. It is my favorite thing that Kierkegaard wrote. And I am a kind of a Kierkegaard fan. He shares the same birthday with me and Karl Marx. But the present age, he talks about this age of abstraction that we live in, this age, this coldness, this age where emotions and feelings are rather fraudulently displayed, and where the reality is a kind of cold calculation that, of course, results in the rule of abstractions. And he says the biggest nothing of all the monstrous abstractions is the public. And of course, the press itself, the journalists, become another kind of abstraction. And one of the readers of the article came up with some other abstractions, of course. The way we think about politics, words like democracy, words like socialism and capitalism, they're abstractions. All these terms that we use, what do we really mean by them? What is concrete in the world that we are actually referring to? What reality? And of course, so I had just seen Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s, I'd actually watched it twice, his interview with Tucker Carlson he did. And it was very disturbing to me. And rereading this book, you know, having just reread it, I thought, you know what, he's the example, because he so offended me. I don't think I've ever been quite that offended, because I had kind of saw some good things in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, but I was disturbed by the footnotes and by the political point of view. But this really showed me the problem, how modern Kennedy was, what a problematic politician he was, because he did a number of things in the interview. He gave every single propaganda lie that Russia gives about the Ukraine war. Just bam, 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 bam. On top of it, all kinds of ignorant things, confusing the city of Sevastopol with the city of Vladivostok, which I'm sure you heard if you heard the interview, saying that the Soviet Union or that Russia was invaded by the Nazis through Ukraine, as if there wasn't this huge Soviet border and Ukraine was only part of the whole picture. He had, in other words, not that there's an offense, but there's, for a man running for president, his historical knowledge was limited, very limited. And so that was very disturbing to me.
Yeah, so so I read your article. I listened to the interview. I even looked at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign website. I focused more on his national defense and economic policies, of course. But how did you mentioned you were tying Kierkegaard's work that you just held up before the viewers and Robert F. Kennedy. Could you elaborate the sort of tie-in with the theme? What kind of abstractions does Robert F. Kennedy engage in? Or is he guilty of not only being merely an ideologue, but of something else? Because when I listened to the interview, I saw many disturbing things and listened to disturbing things too. Can you care to elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, well, of course, a monstrous nothing is this. He's running for president of the United States, but what he's doing is, in essence, he wants the border closed He wants a border wall, but not to protect America, but to protect the illegal aliens from being exploited, which really kind of shocked me in a way, because he's not running for president of all the homeless, poor of the earth. He's running for president of the United States, and that's president of the rich and the poor, the middle class, and the dispossessed. It's everybody, and so this was troubling. And then he had this thing, which is really the biggest nothing of all, which is conspiracy theory. That is replacing history with conspiracy theory. And this is what he did. Um, he accused Harvey King, William Harvey King, the CIA man in charge of Operation Mongoose, of being Oswald's handler. And the CIA killed his uncle, President Kennedy. And it was communists that killed Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald. It was a communist that killed his father, Sirhan Sirhan. So he's blaming the anti-communists for what the communists did. And that is, you could not be more of a nothing if you did anything, but if you reversed the truth, if you inverted the truth, and you made everything into an upside down lie, you couldn't be more of a monstrous nothing. You couldn't exemplify what Kierkegaard was writing about here in the present age. You couldn't have a better example. Your comment?
Yeah, no, I don't even know where to begin, to be honest. I mean, one of the things that was disturbing to both of us, as you mentioned in your article, is this whole treatment of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And what also stuck out to me was his view, was the immigration issue. Not that I'm per se anti-immigrant or you are, but he took a swipe at nationalism and so-called xenophobia too as well, assuming that all people that pose any kind of immigration controls are somehow xenophobe or malicious nationalists. And nationalism comes in different forms, just like capitalism and socialism and free forms of governance, as well as many other political economic systems. Kennedy, I think, absorbs many of the sort of old line, new left, old left, Communist Party, Soviet disinformation lines. And what Jeff and I had been talking about offline, we talked about on other shows, is how many within the political right who really should know better on national defense issues have absorbed much of the rhetoric as propounded by Tucker Carlson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to the point where there's even discussions about the talking points, as you alluded to, about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the president, and also Robert F. Kennedy, the former Attorney General and one-time presidential candidate. And these were individuals that clearly had communist connections. I mean, I'm not going to really go into that. You can go into their communist connections if you'd like, of Sirhan and Lee Harvey Oswald.
But they weren't just connections. These men were self-declared communists.
Correct.
It's in Sirhan Sirhan's diaries. Lee Harvey Oswald, his wife, his friends, everybody knew he was an outspoken Marxist. He had defected to the Soviet Union, so it isn't even a debate. But yet people want to paint him as a CIA double agent, And so this inversion of reality, which in the Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories is so vital, where you have 60% of the American public, according to recent polls, think that there was a conspiracy in the death of Kennedy. And what they mean by that is they don't mean that the communists killed Kennedy. They mean the anti-communists did. The capitalists did, the oil men, or the CIA, or Nixon, or Johnson, or, all the above. The joke, the Dalai Lama under Dealey Plaza organizing a firing squad. It's it is this whole thing is part of what's wrong with American democracy, that a majority of Americans can believe something that is so contrary to fact and reason, and yet they do. And
Yeah.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. not only encourages it, he exemplifies in his position. I mean, look, he is the son and the nephew of these two tragically murdered political figures in American history, and he himself does them the injustice and disservice of flipping it all upside down. He goes in with Sirhan and into prison, and he meets with him, and he comes out of prison, and he says Sirhan is innocent,
Hmm.
which is, Sirhan admitted it 15 to 100 times after he killed Robert F. Kennedy. He didn't deny it. Although now that he sees that all these big people are willing to claim he was innocent, Sirhan would like to get a retrial and get out because he's still in prison in California. But it's out. You know, it makes you think, if Jack Ruby had not killed Oswald, Oswald would probably be a celebrity talk show host right now, and everybody would think he was innocent. I mean, that's almost what I'm left to think.
Well, yeah, there could be sadly enough truth to that. It's rather incredible, and this is really, I mean, like you, there are things I agree with Robert F. Kennedy. I looked at his website. He makes valid points on the need to reindustrialize the United States. He talks about us unifying internally and improving our infrastructure, our social cohesion, and whatnot. He really talks about that because you can't fight, this is my point now I'm making, you can't fight a war with a population that is so divided on all levels. And that really resonated with me. But, you know, and even his critique of the military contractors is valid. But the problem is most of these people that make the critiques of the military industrial establishment, they then flip over and say, well, Russia and China are not a threat. And clearly, Kennedy not only propounds that view, but talks about negotiations and UN peacekeepers and whatnot. And I think about, and you've talked about it as well, Jeff, and we talked about it 2 shows ago, really and truly, you have your UN peacekeepers, you have your peace treaties and demilitarized zones. Look what happened in the Vietnam War between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. We signed the Paris Peace Accords. Those were monitored by international observers, neutrals, allies, as well as Poland and Hungary that were hostile to the United States and allied with North Vietnam. What happened after 273? 2 years
2 years,
later.
yeah.
Tell me what happened 2 years later. Tragedy.
Yeah. The U.S. Congress cut off all of the funding for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and by April 1975, they collapsed. No fuel for their helicopters, tanks, and planes, and no ammunition for their rifles, artillery, and their tanks. So they couldn't fight. They collapsed, and millions died as a result of that collapse. Millions died. So, and it's outrageous that the same arguments that were used to cause us to abandon South Vietnam are being marshaled for us to abandon Ukraine. And you know what's most outrageous? I just want to say this, Tucker Carlson, shame on you. What's most outrageous is he says we are at war with Russia and Ukraine. And that's a lie. We're not at war with Russia. Ukraine is at war with Russia. We're just sending supplies to Ukraine. We're not in war with Russia. There are no Americans fighting Russians in any war. That is just a plain lie. So how it has become so convoluted. See, Tucker Carlson is one of these people too. You know, as much as I like some of the things Tucker Carlson has said, he is one of these empty-headed people who doesn't know anything, who believes in these abstractions that are just plain not true. Abstractions that are unreal, that are nothings. See, when you believe in a nothing, you're believing in something that's untrue or it has nothing to do with reality. And yet you're all preoccupied. You have these ideas, you have these abstractions, these concepts, but they're not connected to anything in the real world. And yet you're highly animated about them. You are literally a kind of cripple where you're unable to come to terms with any political realities, and you're unable to manage or to have strategy, or to have a foreign policy, to have anything that makes sense in the political world and political life. And of course, it's Kierkegaard's point in this book that people who do not have an authentic religious life have this disconnect from reality. They become kind of mad. It's something similar to Carl Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self. They become quite mad. Um, and it's a kind of madness where they kind of become a nothing. Their thought is a nothing. Everything they do is ineffectual. And so I now look on Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in horror to think if he becomes president, anything that you could imagine that could be disastrous or bad, it becomes possible because he is literally not a normal person. He's not connected to reality. He's not grounded.
Yeah, well, one of the things I learned from your essay I did not realize about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. visiting Sirhan and all of a sudden saying the man is innocent, even though he confessed his guilt and even told why he killed Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s father, his support for Israel, as well as also his stated communist beliefs that he wanted to establish so-called workers' dictatorship, whatnot, and everyone can read Jeff's article and see for themselves. And to me, that's very strange. Maybe you could explain why, because I am baffled. And I also wanted to add something regarding Tucker Carlson. We are at war with Russia. No, I'm sorry. Russia has been in a silent and sometimes not so silent war with the United States during its openly communist period, and then during the 1990s and early 2000s. Scores of defectors that you know, Jeff, that you've collaborated with, including with Russia, they have told you in their own words, face to face or over the phone or the email, that Russia is indeed at war with the United States. They obviously get useful things from us to build their war machine, but overall they view us as a rival power to be buried. So number one, I think the issue where we could tie in Kierkegaard's book about where we can tie in the theme of ideological blindness, I think there's also the issue of intellectual bankruptcy. I mean, you have piled up evidence after evidence after evidence, just a lack of intellectual integrity. The facts are that you have laid out, and many others before and after, and not after you, but before and even to this day, many other people have piled up the facts, and it's got to tell you something, that Russia's not our friend. And shame on Tucker Carlson, big time. And I think it's a matter of intellectual lack of integrity. I think that's at hand.
Well,
You've seen that too.
it is a lack of intellectual integrity, but is it due possibly to like a pathology, like a sickness? Because think about how sick this is. The poor man loses his uncle and his father tragically to assassins who are communists. But he so construes and remakes the world outside of the facts that they're innocent, or in the case of Oswald, he's a patsy. He's a CIA agent, and I make the joke in the essay that now Robert Kennedy Jr. has lowered Oswald's standing in hell, and Oswald's got to be pretty mad about it because Oswald wants to get credit in hell for killing Kennedy, but it's taken away from him. He even takes away Oswald's one evil achievement. The fact is that this is some kind of sickness, because this is his own family. It's one thing if it was just a political abstraction, but his abstraction comes into the actual personal loss of family members, where he does not blame the murder of his father. He exonerates him when he's clearly guilty. That's a kind of sickness. And I think that in a way, Robert F. Kennedy is emblematic of the sickness throughout our society. He actually personifies our collective madness. And it is a kind of madness. And how do you explain it? Well, I turn to Eric Voegelin. This is Voegelin's book, The Modernity Without Restraint. And what Voegelin says, which is very controversial, and you don't like to come to this conclusion, but our latter-day liberals, he says, are just right-wing communists. So, and that's when if you listen to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. carefully enough, you'll hear it. He really wants the same kind of beautiful future that the communists want, only he wants to go there organically on the slow plan using democracy, not violence. But he really wants to go to the same place. So to have somebody who's passionate like Oswald or Sirhan who actually believes in the same paradise, they have the same dream, they're just violent. He needs to deny their violence, he needs to identify with them, and he needs to make the violence all about the anti-communists who want to resist the dream. See, because he sees the anti-communists as the evil ones because they're standing in the way of the dream that he and Oswald and Sirhan want. So he can't ever really admit that Sirhan and Oswald killed Kennedy. And I think that's the whole explanation for Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney that hounded Clay Shaw and almost ruined him, tried to convict him of murdering President Kennedy falsely, that they made the movie JFK about. This district attorney was a monster who intimidated witnesses, falsified evidence, committed crimes to try to make his case. Again, a sign of a pathological person who can't believe someone of the left would do something awful. It's only the Hitlers and the anti-communists who are little Hitlers who are really the bad guys. This distorted worldview is actually the worldview of the liberal left. It's Kennedy's view. And the fact that he would accuse William King Harvey and these other CIA guys because they were anti-communists, and that he would not even acknowledge that his own father was an anti-communist who was going after to kill Castro. It's just such a profound, it's sick.
Yeah, I mean, and I wanted to bring up another point that you brought up in your article, and I haven't seen this in a while, and I'm glad you brought it up, is the phenomenon of anti-communism, which is a very masochistic doctrine which has pervaded law, particularly during the latter part of the Cold War and even beyond the Democratic Party. And it split American liberalism too as well. And many of the liberals, I mean, many of your readers would consider me probably a liberal, an old style liberal or whatever you want to call it from the 1940s, 50s, whatever. People like us were pushed out liberalism and made politically homeless. So we went to conservatism or wherever, we just disappeared. And now you have this phenomenon of anti-communism, which exists. And there are elements of the pro-communist left that love Robert Kennedy with reservations because they don't like his support for Israel. You have the political commentator, Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore never met an anti-imperialist dictator that he didn't like, apologize for, or justify, to put it rather crudely, in my opinion. And yet Robert Kennedy is kind of in that orbit where the so-called anti-imperialist left really likes him for the most part. And they view his base of supporters as potential supporters for communism. I mean, Caleb Maupin of the Center for Political Innovation USA, former Workers' World Party advocate, and staunch supporter of every anti-U.S. dictatorship out there. He said, we got to go into the camp of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we got to go into Marianne Williamson's camp, and we got to poach supporters. So obviously they're attracting elements that are very deleterious for American national security, potentially. Do you often wonder, Jeff, do you think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. perhaps got into contact with, let's just say, very questionable people who influenced him in a certain way? Do you think that's possible? Have you toyed with that idea?
I don't know what to make out of it, except that a person like it's impossible, given his family history, the assassination of his uncle and his father, for him not to be sincerely deluded in what he thinks. Because if he were doing it consciously, he would be ashamed and embarrassed every time he said these things. It's not the kind of thing you would lie about consciously to curry favor. It is something that you, if you got twisted up in your own head, would believe if you were really screwed up. And it's the other thing is to it's almost like, see, this liberalism is this idea that you've got this wonderful future world that you're building with all this love and all this do-goodism that you're going to make, which basically shows no knowledge of history, no understanding of how problematic human beings are, how problematic society is, how problematic differences between societies are. This is a very childish ideology. It's like this guy never got out of elementary school in terms of his political wisdom. And so you've got that level of, I guess you could say, knowledge or understanding, that low level of understanding, you know, the belief in these abstract nothings that are really, he's never really examined these concepts. He's never thought philosophically. He's never attempted to have any real understanding. He's never struggled with any of this. He has just taken what is emotionally most satisfying and to be the good guy and to get along with everybody. And he has just sort of followed along this liberal, this right-wing communism that Eric Voegelin calls says that liberalism is. And so he is not a thought leader. Mr. Kennedy is the ultimate, I guess you could say, zombie of the great monstrous political nothingism of our time. And the interesting thing is the appeal he has both on the right and the left. A lot of people on the right are interested in him because the right, we don't understand this, but the active measures of the communists and the dumbing down have sort of tenderized the right to where the right is almost ready to merge with the communist left. That is, you can see it like it's happening. I am losing my readers because just by writing about this, I'm losing readers. Just by being pro-Ukraine and anti-Putin, I'm losing readers. I have been consistent for 35 years. I have realized what's going on and I've tried to piece it together, but it's consistent. My understanding, and if somebody shows me where I'm wrong, that I'm factually off, I'll change everything. I'll flip. But nobody showed me the error of my ways yet. I'm waiting. And I'm looking at this guy, and this guy does nothing but make errors and show complete ignorance. And it's like, this is what we've become. The right and the left are ready to be merged into a giant proletariat that's ready to overthrow the man or the system. And I don't know, I don't see an easy way out.
Yeah, no, I want to add things. It could be, and we're just sussing things out, ladies and gentlemen in the audience here, because it really is perplexing. I agree. It's almost otherworldly of why he can just justify or go soft on the killer of his own father. It's just, I think it could be one of two things, and I think you hit upon a possible point, and that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We know he was always deeply critical and suspicious of the establishment, including Big Pharma and other aspects of the political and economic establishment. And I think what can happen, and this happens with men and women on the left more often than not in this case, I don't want to sound rude when I say this, so forgive me, but your mind can get so addled by your hatred of the establishment, you start to then not see things for what they are, like, okay, the establishment is wrong on that because factually A, B, C, and D. And then they just say, well, everything coming out of the mouths of the establishment is wrong. So when they say Russia is aggressor and Ukraine should be supported, oh, they got to be wrong because it's the establishment, because they're all part of big pharma, and they have to be wrong about every single little thing. And that might be part of it. It's hard. I never met the man. I don't know him. I don't know people who know him. So it's hard to really get into the man's head. But that could be the issue,
Some
possibly.
people,
I don't know. I mean, it's just perplexing. The other thing is that you have ideologues, whether they're libertarian, whether they're idealistic Marxists, whether they're idealistic Nazis, whatever. They often see the world as they want to see rather than the world as it actually is.
yeah.
And you have people on the left, people on the right are guilty of that. Um, that's why for me personally, I like to pick and choose according to the issues, what's factual, what comports with human nature, what comports with historical record, what is, quote, the right thing to do by your people. As you term father of your country, I think you've mentioned that in your essay. So what are your thoughts about my theories I'm throwing out here about Robert Kennedy's possible motivations? I mean, am I crazy?
Well, the only thing I can think of is some people will come up with something like Stockholm syndrome, right?
Mm.
I mean, here's a family that's been two assassinated, patrons in the family, patriarchs, sorry, in the family. Um, is this is this why Teddy Kennedy turned to the left and became a little tattler to the Soviet elite? Would go to Moscow and tell the Soviet secrets out of school? Is it that you just you want to have a good relationship with the people who've taken you hostage because you don't want them to murder you too? I mean, is that what it is? In that case, having Russian nuclear weapons pointed at the whole country, maybe that's part of the syndrome, that we all have hostage syndrome because we've been hostage to Russian and now Chinese nuclear weapons so long, we're ready to cooperate, right? We've been mentally conditioned. I don't know if I like that theory or if it explains it, but because I rather think that Eric Voegelin is correct because he looked at this so long and he had such a profound mind. Because Voegelin basically makes the argument that we have the modernity. When we think of politics, we it's a Gnostic form of religion, which means we think politics is going to save us and create this beautiful future world. We're going to achieve heaven on earth through politics. We're going to monetize the Gnostic eschaton through politics. And that means that anybody who gets in the way of this perfect world they're going to make. Now, I'm a student of history, and I'm very firm on this. And I'm sorry if I'm insulting people, but if you don't know that that's completely crazy, then you just simply aren't a cultured person. You have no intellectual culture. You don't understand history or human nature. There is never going to be heaven on earth. Human beings aren't going to be angels. There is no socialist utopia. It's a lie, right? And the thing is that the most dangerous people, it turns out, we learned this in the 20th century, the most dangerous people, more dangerous than the fanatics of any religion, that killed people, are the socialists. The socialists who want to build a better world. Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Castro, Pol Pot, you name it. They murdered 100 million or more people in the 20th century, and I think they're going to murder even more in the 21st. I think they're going to top their numbers. And that's what I think. And I think it after reading ancient history all the way through and modern history. And my medieval history is kind of there. But the thing is that when you read enough of it, you get it. You understand. You know, reading ancient history is very difficult because you're reading it by people who are trying to be, who invented objectivity. People like Thucydides, right? You want to see what really happened. You want to see mankind without any ideological makeup on. You want to see the real us. And when you read that, you go, this is really scary because human beings can be scary monsters. And they are always going to have that potential. And that's never going away. Sorry. And unless you can accept that and be an adult, be one of the adults in the room, and do like the founding fathers did and make a constitution with checks and balances and say, you know, you read the Federalist Papers, human nature is bad. We're making this constitution because human nature is bad, and democracy is bad because it's human nature on a giant scale voting. Democracy is not our system. Our system is an element of democracy to check monarchy and aristocracy, and you've got the court, right? You've got the legislature and the executive and the judiciary, and then you have federalism. You have all these states, and you've divided up the power, and you're not allowing power to be in one hand because, as Lord Acton said, absolute power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So that's my understanding, which is not an ideology. It's real historical understanding. I mean, that's your feet on the ground. Robert F. Kennedy does not have that. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. does not have that. I think his uncle and his dad had some of it. I think people who grew up in the older America had more of that. They understood it better. I don't think this current generation, I don't think my generation, which Robert F. Kennedy is of my generation, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is of my generation, I don't think they get it because I did something unusual. I spent a good part of my life studying history, and most people didn't, and they have these childish political ideals. And I'm not sure there's any saving them from it. I'm not sure there is.
Well, and we've talked about this on many occasions, many shows. I've also talked about it in my book a little bit on Turning the Page, which is the title of my latest book. And what's lacking is this sense of stewardship by our leadership class and really all elements of the elites. There's quite a bit I agree with, and even if you take more of a progressive view on the evolution, as I do to some degree, of the Constitution to solve real world problems as the country evolves, you always have to have an understanding, and this is where I agree with you, when you give government new powers on certain select issues and challenges, you also have to have always in place checks and balances. That's very, very important, because when men and women have too much aggregated power, they can create potentially massive mischief. I think if you remember, I hate to throw in popular culture, but I think it might have been on the newer Spider-Man movies, where the young Spider-Man was told by his father, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think quite a bit of that ethic has been lost over time. I don't think it's ever been present in human history ever since really the creation of humanity. But as an observer, I would agree with you. You just look at history. You look at the history of the Axis powers, radical Islamic totalitarianism, communist totalitarianism, which exists today. The body count is not over, unfortunately, on the communist atrocities and killings. And it may continue, as you pointed out, on a grander scale. The notion of the perfect world, we've talked about this many, many, many times. I've addressed it in my writings too. We can build a better country. I mean, as you even pointed out in your essay on the show, a presidential candidate, senator, or congressman, their first responsibility is to the citizenry of all classes, you pointed out very well. Yes, you can want good things for the world and help, but you have to prioritize your own people first. It's like Ms. Kennedy's discussion of the border. Yes, I don't like how undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants, whatever you want to call them. I don't like how they're abused by human traffickers or employers. I've read extensively about that, as I'm sure you have as well. But there's also an element of preserving your nation. You can't have open borders. It's like opening the doors of your house, Jeff. You open the doors to your house and you let everybody in where you live. There's no guarantee people are not going to ransack your house and steal. You might have good people that respect you, blah, blah, blah. You have to have a vetting process. You can't have open borders. And I'm not saying that he should, but you're right. He should have said, yes, we have a humanitarian viewpoint with foreigners, but most importantly, we have to protect our own people. It's our house. It's our home. I would do the same thing with my home.
He refuses to make that argument, and so I compare him to a father of 5 children who's more concerned with all the other children in the neighborhood than his own. And there is something deeply disturbing about that. If you met a man like that, you would not be feeling comfortable with that person.
No.
He's neglecting his own children, but he cares about all the others. It's like the guy who well, it's from Gilbert and Sullivan, who likes all countries but his own, and all times except the time he lives in. You know, this is, and of course the philanthropist who loves all humanity but hates every particular individual he runs into. I mean, it's, you know, the genuine philanthropist. All other kinds of sham. There's something disturbing in that, and it's a phenomenon that we have run across. It's a modern phenomenon, and it goes along with this Gnosticism that Voegelin talks about. And of course, Voegelin says that the people that go for this utopian socialist religion are alienated people. They're alienated, and of course, alienated touches on the word madness, because what we used to call a psychologist or psychiatrist in the 19th century, we called him an alienist, because he dealt with the alienated, and the madmen were alienated from reality, alienated from God. And so this is really intriguing, because you look at the revolutionaries, the socialist ones, whether they're National Socialist or Communist Socialist, and they're alienated and they're mad. You know, they're psychopaths. People like Stalin and Mao and Lenin were not psychologically normal. And so you look at Robert Kennedy. Is he a right-wing communist who is not as murderous, of course, as these other figures, but he's trying to get to the same place? And it's the same inversion of reality, because he inverts reality. You say, why does he invert reality? It's because he's alienated in some profound level. He has to invert it. And this is the disease of modernity par excellence. It is what we are confronting. And it's why you have men trying to become women and women trying to become men. I suspect that the gender confusion issues boil down to this, an attempt to literally transform the sexes into each other. That's part of it. And of course, it's all an identity disorder. If you look at narcissism, if you look at borderline personality disorder, you look at all of these mental disorders, they are identity disorders. If you look at what they actually stem from, it's from not accepting who you are and where you are and your fate, what is given by God. It's a kind of rejection and rebellion, where there is no grace in the universe. And there's this nihilism of the great inversion, the negation of the negation. And of course, the negation of the negation is one of those Marxist expressions where you're going to destroy the awfulness of the world to bring about, you know, this future utopia. But it's kind of telling, because it's very negative, right? And of course, what does Kierkegaard say? He calls it a nothing. What does negation give you? You know, 2 minus 2 is 0. You get a negate, you get a 0. You get a nothing. And that's what I'm afraid it all amounts to.
And you talk about alienation. What was going through my head was why I always rejected the hard left throughout my entire life. And I remember reading an article in Commentary magazine. And it was David Horowitz and Peter Collier. I read in high school. And they related, and David Horowitz was a former editor of Ramparts magazine. And on the cover of one issue back from the late 1960s or so, it had a picture with a protester, youthful protester, the Viet Cong flag, saying alienation is when your country is at war and you want the other side to win. And that's a recurring theme with much of, in my opinion, the hard left in some form or another, in different degrees. And that's what always turned me off from the hard left, is because they really would like to see the country collapse. And many people have documented, you've seen it up close and personal. Um, I mean, when you met those communists in your graduate school career, or your attempt at it, didn't you see alienated people when you talked and
Oh
discussed
yeah.
issues? I mean, maybe you can
Oh yeah.
tell us. I meant to ask you on 2 shows ago. I mean, what were these people really like personally? Were they nice?
I'll give you an example. This one Colombian Marxist, very angry. He was from Colombia, and we had the class was Introduction to Political Analysis, and we had this huge number of students, and we decided as a team, we did a great job. We buckled down, we all worked together, we graded all the papers, we got it all done, and we went out for pizza and beers. And of course, we ended up taking the party to one of the other graduate students' houses. And then I was the designated driver, so I wasn't drinking.
Mm.
And this Colombian fellow talks about walking down the boardwalk, and there's a beautiful moon on Laguna Beach. And then he thinks of all the poor people in the world, the starving, the downtrodden, and then everything just feels black. And then his next thought, he admitted, was that in 100 years, no one would remember him. Think about the juxtaposition. And then this was, I didn't understand it at the time, but this is basically an identity disorder, because he has to save the world to save himself, because he believes there is no meaning, there's no God, there's no grace in the world unless he becomes Jesus Christ and he saves the world, and then people remember him in 100 years, right? And this is a very peculiar thing, that one must become a kind of a communist God. And this is exactly what you find in Chambers' letter to my children, where he says that communism is the world's second oldest religion, that the snake in the Garden of Eden told Eve, well, surely if you eat the fruit, you will be like gods, you won't die. And it's the idea that you're going to be a god. And this, of course, is problematic, because if you're going to be God, then what happens to your humanity? And look at the grandiosity of it. It's narcissism. It's an identity disorder, and it's extremely dangerous because it's really close to what a psychopath is, ultimately, in the psychology. And this is a guy who hated Americans. I would see him walk up and practically make undergraduate girls cry by saying, I hate Americans, I hope you all die. You know, I want to see you all wiped out. I mean, he would literally do that. And just with flames coming out of him, you know, just literally a flaming, hating communist, if you'd ever seen one. And of course, that's an example of one of these people. This is like what you kind of see coming out of Castro, the young Castro, Fidel Castro and Raul. When you look at Castro's speeches, you see the same kind of, you know, fire and brimstone communist. Wants to rain hell and death on America. And so you think to yourself, this is pretty crazy. I'll give you another episode he did. I was in a class with him once, and he suggested in this seminar that we should try to run the entire world without money, without a medium of exchange. And it was a political economy seminar, graduate seminar. And I said, well, of course, you know that if you do this, most of the world's population will starve to death. And you know what he said? So that's what
Oh,
he said.
this is what, and this is one of the reasons why I like to have the interviews, because this is important information, and your anecdotal experience is important to curate for people to see, because this is important information. The other thing is this ties in perfectly with your earlier discussion of Gnosticism translated into political fanaticism. This is an example. So when you see this practical experience of meeting these people, like the Colombian Marxist, and then you connect the dots with the philosophy that you read, you're like, I'm sure you're like, oh my God, it becomes alive in an unpleasant way.
You can't understand Marxism or Leninism unless you read the biography of Marx and the biography of Lenin, and then you spend some time hanging out with communists or Marxists. Only then can you understand it as a whole, what it really is.
And the same is with neo-Nazis. They're, look, I've talked about it at length in my writings, you have too, about the injustices, and it pushes people and radicalizes them. But I have found too, I had a friend who was a communist. He was clearly an idealist. But I've also met people that were fascists. And they were all radicalized for, you could say, understandable reasons. But there was an anger. There was an uncontrollable anger and a nihilism, not a defeat, almost a defeated, I don't know what to say, a defeatism, but
yeah. Well,
it's hard to explain. I generally don't hang around people like that in my social and political circles, but there's definitely something off.
Well, read a close biography of Lee Harvey Oswald. His mother was extremely narcissistic. And a good example of it is that when Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president, she tried to get all the attention for herself. She was very upset that people wanted to interview Robert Oswald, Lee Oswald's brother, and Marina Oswald, his wife. They weren't as interested in his mother, and she was mad as can be. And she wanted to also make money from the celebrity, right? So, but this is the kind of mother she was. She was a mother who put her boys into an orphanage when they were very young. She drove away all the men that were interested in her. She neglected her boys. In fact, her sons wanted to go off and join the Marines and escape from this monster, this monster woman. And of course, I think, as I recall, Oswald, when he came back to America from Russia with his Russian wife, didn't even bother to tell his mother that they'd had a baby. He didn't really want his mother in his life. And of course, the narcissistic injury that a narcissist does to a child, especially the youngest child, Oswald was the youngest of her children. He was the golden child. She really damaged him. In fact, one of the Secret Service agents had been signed to Jackie Kennedy, had interviewed Marina, and had Marguerite Oswald, Oswald's mother, barging in constantly, just jealous of her daughter-in-law, getting the attention from the Secret Service, until he practically had to tell her to shut up. And he commented, he said, "Now I know why Lee Harvey Oswald turned out the way he did. It was Oswald's mother that did this to him," right? That in effect, or that he allowed his mother to affect him in that way. And so when you read his biography, you see that anger, that hair-trigger temper that Oswald had at times, especially when he's younger. He got in a lot of fights. that inability to fit in, that inability to get along with people, that need to be super important, to that grandiosity that narcissists have. You know, this is what this guy that wrote this book, this is a very interesting book, The Oswalds. It's written by a guy who knew these folks. And of course, he's an economist now. He's quite older. Paul R. Gregory, he spent the summer of '62 with the Oswalds, showing them around. He spoke Russian. His father was from Russia, and helped him out. And he said one thing he says about Oswald in here, he had this grandiosity, had these grandiose self-conception of himself. And see, this is what's really dangerous. It's dangerous about Marxism. It's dangerous about Hitlerism, about Hitler. Hitler was this narcissist, right? It was all of this grandiosity that he had. And this is where this real danger and this violence and this horror comes from.
Yeah, no, I agree. And people have commented on this on the left and the right. People as diverse as the former Soviet Communist Party International Department's defector Igor Glogolev, I could read some quotes for the audience, to even Chris Hedges, who is very much in many ways on the hard left, but he has reported from Central America, the Middle East, and Europe, and he has seen the revolutionaries of the left up hand, and he does not like them. So and I think they both succinctly, make really cutting points, to be honest. So, So Igor Glogolev, makes really good points. And I had seen that too as well. Chris Hedges, he said, the cult of the gun, he said, and wrote in 2018, the cult of the gun was disastrous. It distorted reality. It elevated violence as the only real tool for revolution. The cult of the gun saw most third world liberation movements, such as the National Liberation Front in Algeria, devolve into squalid military dictatorships when they took power. And then you have someone on the other side of the spectrum, Glogolev, observed that in reality, the KGB agents are the scum of the Western and Soviet societies. Some of them, Donald McLean, Jay Smith, and others, worked at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, or IMEMO, which still exists today, as research members. I met them and I tried to avoid them, not to shake their hands. They were despicable, immoral creatures who were always ready to betray anybody. So, what are your thoughts about that? Any surprises?
No, well, to really understand the motivations of a narcissist, it's they're this lust for power coming out of their impotence. They are disconnected from themselves because they're denying their true self, and so they have attenuated affect. That's where you get to the sociopathy, right? The sociopathy, I should say, rather. And then, of course, there is the grandiosity, and there is the envy that motivates them. They really, this book on narcissism, written by a narcissist, I'm not thinking of the name. He was very famous. He was a narcissist. He was an Israeli who wrote this brilliant book on narcissism from having been one and having examined himself. It was I can't remember the title, but it was so brilliant. But he described envy as a kind of stew. There always is stewing in envy and invidious comparisons with others. And it's really a truly frightening depiction. And of course, no wonder they're angry, and they alternate between anger and depression. Because if you have enough energy, you're angry. If you're out of energy, you're depressed, right? Because depression is just the other side of anger. And it's a miserable condition that one need not ever enter, but yet they're trapped in it. They're trapped. And these are unfortunately, we live in an age in the modern age where these people have been rising to prominence as heads of corporations, as politicians, as celebrities. And it's It's really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the problem of concentrated power, whether in major corporations, and you have to have checks and balances, or what the late economist John Kenneth Galbraith called countervailing power, and that you have to constantly have that to some degree or another in government when considering new government powers that may be necessary in the name of national security or improving the economy, or in the case of capitalism too as well. Um, at the bottom line, when people have power, they're not going to follow the quote that I just gave from one of the Spider-Man movies, with great power comes great responsibility.
And of course, these people, the first thought in their mind is not to be honorable, but to be famous, to be rich, to be evil, whatever you have to do to achieve that. And that is what's made our modern politics what it is.
Yeah, here's one thing. I don't mean to shift the subject. This was the actual quote I was trying to find from Hedges. And he states this beautifully. He argued when he was in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and he was a staunch critic of the Sandinistas, as well as the various Christian democratic as well as right-wing military dictatorships in El Salvador. This is what he observed about the Salvadoran FMLN, the Sandinistas, and other revolutionaries. He argued that, quote, human beings are seduced by power and violence, and the left is seduced by power and violence. It just has to be power and violence coming from governments or groups that are deemed revolutionary. Most revolutionaries, I can tell you, having covering them, many of them are pretty unsavory characters, like anyone who wields a weapon. And I think that pretty much sums it up very well. And here's a man of the left, an independent but hard leftist. Any closing comments, Jeff?
No, that's pretty good. Yeah, so Robert Kennedy in this age of abstract nothings and monstrous nothings is a bad sign. It's a sign that we're on the downward path, and maybe a steep downward path downward. And unless we can recover something substantial within ourselves, within our souls, unless we can recover morality and honor and goodness, genuine goodness within ourselves, we're done. We're not going to make it. Not in this, later on, humanity will always come back, but this is going to be very tragic. It's going to be a fall, a really hard, long descent into destruction and chaos. And this is what is so disturbed me. I looked at Kennedy and I saw an omen of the America's decline and destruction. And he was a living, breathing omen. So.
Yeah, his positions, as you laid out in the article, the blog post, the paper, opinion piece, summed up many of my concerns too. His view on foreign policy and national security is deeply disturbing, and I have to say that despite our agreement with parts of his platform, his other parts of his platform, what he said in the interview with Tucker, is deeply disqualifying, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I hate to say it.
It's a shame. It's just a shame.
Well, I know it's a very kind of somber ending to the show, but I hope the audience was informed. Jeff, you were very informative, and in that article, I learned new things. We're running out of time. I didn't know that about the P2 Lodge being infiltrated by the KGB. Maybe we can do a little show next week where we cover that. So I learned something every day. Jeff, you've taught me a lot of new information over, well, the past 2 decades now, since I started to read your works. And I want to thank you for that, and thank you for joining us. And stay tuned for next week's show. Have a good night, everybody. God bless. And be safe and take care.
Okay, very good.
Okay. Let me just hold on. All right. So let me just.
Did it work?